The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of Walker's Corner Store, a family-owned convenience shop that had been serving the neighborhood for over 2 decades. Inside, 16-year-old Andrew Walker moved methodically through the aisles, his dark curly hair slightly messy from the long school day. He wasn't wearing his usual store uniform, just his favorite basketball team hoodie and jeans, since he'd come straight from basketball practice to help out. The store had been unusually busy that day, and the shelves needed serious reorganizing. Andrew had his own system for restocking, one he'd developed over the years of helping his dad. He'd inherited his father's attention to detail, and it showed in how carefully he handled each item. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably his friends from the debate team wondering where he was, but he stayed focused on his task. As the store's hip-hop playlist played softly in the background, Andrew moved through his routine with practiced ease. He'd stuff a few candy bars in his hoodie pocket temporarily while rearranging the display, then move them to their proper places. A habit his father had initially scolded him for, but eventually accepted as part of his son's efficient workflow. Regular customers who came in would wave hello, familiar with seeing him there after school. Mrs. Chen, who'd been coming to the store since Andrew was knee-high, stopped by his aisle. Working hard as always, she smiled, reaching for her usual brand of green tea. "How's the college application process going?" Andrew lit up at the question. He just finished his personal essay for Howard University the night before, where he hoped to study business like his father. "Getting there, Mrs. Chen. Dad's been helping me with the essays. He keeps saying running this store is the best business school there is." The store had become more than just a family business for Andrew. Between the after-school hours helping out and weekends learning the inventory system, he'd grown to understand why his father took such pride in the place. It wasn't just about selling snacks and supplies, it was about being part of the community's daily life. As he worked, Andrew couldn't help but smile at the memory of his younger self, barely able to reach the top shelves, standing on milk crates to help his dad stock items. Now he could easily reach everything, though his father still joked about him being too skinny despite his height. The store had been his after-school home for as long as he could remember, filled with the sounds of the bell chiming as customers entered, the hum of the refrigerators, and the friendly chatter of neighbors. Between reorganizing the candy aisle and checking expiration dates, Andrew kept an eye on the clock. His father would be back soon from meeting with suppliers, and he wanted to have everything looking perfect. He had big plans to suggest some changes to their inventory system, maybe even introduce an app for regular customers. His father always said the store needed to keep up with the times, and Andrew was eager to help bring some fresh ideas. The satisfaction of seeing the neat rows of products, perfectly aligned and organized, made him smile. He'd inherited that perfectionist streak from his dad, along with the belief that anything worth doing was worth doing right. Little did he know that this ordinary afternoon of restocking shelves was about to turn into something that would change not just his life, but the entire community's perspective on important issues they'd been facing for years. The familiar electronic chime of the front door echoed through the store as someone entered. Andrew didn't look up immediately, absorbed in his work and thinking about the calculus test he had tomorrow. He reached into his pocket to relocate some more items, unaware that this simple, routine gesture would trigger a chain of events that would make headlines across the city. Officer Richard Thompson had been having a rough day. 3 traffic disputes, a fender bender, and mountains of paperwork had left him irritable. New to this neighborhood after transferring from the suburbs, he was still adjusting to the different rhythm of city life. As he drove past Walker's Corner Store, something caught his eye. A young man in a hoodie, seemingly stuffing items into his pockets. Without taking a moment to observe the full situation, Thompson pulled his patrol car into the small parking lot, the tires crunching over loose gravel. His mind was already made up about what he was seeing. 6 years on the force had left him thinking he could size up any situation in seconds, though lately his captain had been getting onto him about jumping to conclusions. The store's bell chimed as Thompson pushed through the door, his hand instinctively resting on his belt. The hip-hop music playing softly through the speakers only reinforced his prejudices. He spotted Andrew immediately, still focused on his work, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. "Hen you, empty your pockets." Thompson's voice boomed through the quiet store, making Mrs. Chen jump and nearly drop her tea. Andrew looked up, confused, as the officer strode toward him with an intensity that seemed completely out of place in the peaceful store. "Sir?" Andrew straightened up, his hands naturally rising in a non-threatening gesture. "I work here. I'm just restocking there." "I said empty your pockets. Now." Thompson cut him off, his voice growing louder. The few customers in the store began pulling out their phones, some recording, others looking worried. The afternoon sun cast Thompson's shadow long across the floor, making him appear even more intimidating as he towered over Andra. "Officer, I can explain. My dad owns this store. I'm just—" Andrew tried to reach for his store ID in his back pocket, but Thompson immediately tensed up. "Don't move. Keep your hands where I can see them." The officer's reaction was instant and aggressive, causing several customers to gasp. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her usually quiet voice finding strength. "Officer, please, this is Mr. Walker's son. He works here every—" "Ma'am, step back. This is police business," Thompson interrupted, not even glancing her way. His tunnel vision was focused entirely on Andra, whose calm demeanor seemed to irritate the officer even more. Andrew's heart was pounding, but years of his father's advice rang in his ears. Stay calm, speak clearly, don't make sudden moves. He kept his voice steady, despite the fear and anger building inside him. "Sir, if you'll just let me show you my ID." "Turn around, hands behind your back," Thompson ordered, already reaching for his handcuffs. The metal clicked coldly in the suddenly silent store. The music still played softly in the background, creating an eerily inappropriate soundtrack to the scene unfolding. Regular customers watched in horror as Andrew was handcuffed, their young friend who'd grown up before their eyes being treated like a criminal in his own family's store. Mr. Lee from the dry cleaners next door had wandered in during the commotion and was already on his phone, frantically trying to reach Andrew's father. "My dad will be back any minute," Andrew said, his voice finally showing a slight tremor. "He just went to meet with suppliers. Please, just wait." "You can explain it all down at the station," Thompson cut him off again, seemingly deaf to the chorus of protests from the gathering crowd of regular customers. The officer was so convinced of his own rightness that he didn't notice the store's security cameras recording everything, or the growing number of phone cameras pointed his way. Just then, the store's bell chimed again. The afternoon sun silhouetted a tall figure in the doorway, and the atmosphere in the store shifted dramatically. Andrew felt a wave of relief wash over him as heavy footsteps approached. His father had returned, and the real story was about to unfold. The tension in Walker's corner store could be cut with a knife. Andrew stood there in handcuffs, maintaining his composure even as his heart raced. The officer's stern grip on his arm felt unnecessarily tight, but he remembered his father's words from their many conversations about dealing with authority. "Your dignity is your strongest weapon." Officer Thompson had started to move toward the door, pushing Andrew forward, when Mrs. Chen's voice rang out again, stronger this time. "I'm recording everything," she announced, her phone held steady despite her shaking hands. "This boy has worked here since he was tall enough to reach the bottom shelf. You're making a terrible mistake." The growing crowd of regular customers had formed a semicircle near the entrance. Mr. Lee from the dry cleaners had positioned himself right by the door, his arms crossed. "The owner is on his way," he said firmly. "Just wait 5 minutes. That's all we're asking." Thompson's face reddened. "Clear the doorway. You're obstructing police business." His voice carried the edge of someone who knew they might be wrong, but was too proud to back down. The small crowd didn't move an inch. "You know what?" Andrew spoke up, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "I'd like to exercise my right to make a phone call right now." He learned about citizens' rights in his civics class, and even in his current situation, he couldn't help but appreciate the irony of using that knowledge. "You can make all the calls you want at the station," Thompson snapped back, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice now. The number of recording phones had multiplied, and through the store windows, he could see more neighbors gathering outside. Mrs. Rodriguez, who ran the bakery 3 doors down, pushed through the entrance, still wearing her flour-dusted apron. "Officer, I've known this young man since he was in diapers. His father built this store from nothing. You're making a huge mistake." The hip-hop music that had been playing suddenly cut off, leaving an even heavier silence. The security cameras in each corner of the store continued their silent recording, their small red lights blinking steadily. A younger customer, probably a college student, spoke up from near the refrigerators. "I've already uploaded the first part of this to social media. It's getting shares." Andra felt a small sense of victory when he noticed Thompson's grip loosen slightly. The officer's eyes darted around the store, finally taking in details he should have noticed from the beginning: the family photos behind the counter, the community bulletin board full of local events and announcements, the Employee of the Month plaque that had Andrew's photo from last summer. "Sir," Andrew tried one more time, keeping his voice respectful but firm, "those security cameras have been recording everything. They show me working, restocking shelves like I do every day after school. I know you're just trying to do your job, but maybe we could wait for my dad. He can clear this up in seconds." Thompson's radio crackled to life with a dispatcher's voice asking for a status update. Before he could respond, the store's bell chimed again. This time, several customers called out at once, "Mr. Walker." Andrew turned his head to see his father's familiar figure filling the doorway, still holding the folder of supplier invoices he'd been reviewing. The look on his father's face was one Andrew had never seen before, a complex mixture of anger, pain, and determination. Mr. Walker took one look at his son in handcuffs, then at Officer Thompson, and then at the crowd of loyal customers and neighbors who had gathered to support his boy. The air in the store seemed to change, charged with the potential energy of what would happen next. "I believe," Mr. Walker said, his deep voice carrying the weight of years of earned respect in the community, "you have made a serious error in judgment with my son, Officer." He stepped forward, supplier documentation still in hand, his presence commanding attention without raising his voice. "And we're going to address this right now, but first, take those handcuffs off my boy." The next few moments would prove crucial, not just for Andrew and his father, but for the entire neighborhood. The way Mr. Walker handled the next few minutes would become a story people would tell for years to come, about dignity in the face of prejudice, and the power of a community standing together. The atmosphere in Walker's corner store crackled with tension as Mr. Walker slowly placed his supplier folders on the counter. Every eye in the store watched as he straightened his tie, a habit from his corporate days before opening the store. His calm demeanor somehow made the situation even more intense. "First things first," Mr. Walker said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of earning respect rather than demanding it. "Those handcuffs, they come off my son." Now, he didn't shout. He didn't need to. Officer Thompson found himself caught in a moment of indecision. The growing crowd of community members, the recording phones, and now the commanding presence of this businessman-turned-store owner made him acutely aware that this situation had spiraled far beyond what he'd initially assumed. "Sir, I need to see some identification first," Thompson managed to say, though his voice had lost its earlier edge. "Of course." Mr. Walker reached for his wallet with deliberate slowness. "But while I'm getting that, let me tell you what you'll find in this store. You'll find 16 security cameras that have recorded my son working here every day after school for the past 4 years. You'll find a bulletin board full of community event flyers that we've hosted. You'll find photos behind the counter of 3 generations of Walkers." As he spoke, he pulled out not just his ID, but also the store's business license, Andrew's work permit, and recent supplier invoices. "You'll also find," he continued, laying each document on the counter, "about 24 witnesses who can verify that my son belongs here. Because this isn't just a store, Officer Thompson, this is our community's heart." Mrs. Chen stepped forward, placing her phone down but keeping it recording. "When my husband was sick last year, Andrew delivered our groceries every day after school. He wouldn't even take gas money. He helped my daughter apply for college," Mr. Lee added from near the door, "spent hours helping her with the essays." Officer Thompson's face flushed as he studied the documents. The weight of his mistake began to sink in, made heavier by each new voice that spoke up for Andra. Almost reluctantly, he reached for his handcuff keys. As the cuffs came off, Andrew rubbed his wrists but maintained his composure. His father had taught him that how you handle tough moments defines your character more than the easy ones. "Son," Mr. Walker said softly, putting a hand on Andrew's shoulder, "why don't you go finish your inventory count in the back?" It wasn't really a question. It was his father's way of giving him a moment to collect himself with dignity. Once Andrew had gone to the back room, Mr. Walker turned his full attention to Officer Thompson. The store had grown so quiet you could hear the hum of the refrigerators. "Now," he said, "we're going to have a conversation about what happened here today. But first, I want to thank everyone who stood up for my boy." He glanced around at the gathered crowd, nodding his appreciation. Some people had tears in their eyes. Others wore expressions of grim satisfaction. All of them knew they had witnessed something important. "Officer," Mr. Walker continued, "I could file a complaint. I could call the media, though from the looks of those phones, they'll be calling me soon enough. I could make this a very difficult day for you and your department." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But that's not how we do things in this community." Thompson seemed to shrink slightly under Mr. Walker's steady gaze. The officer's hand, which had rested so confidently on his weapon earlier, now hung uncertainly at his side. Instead, Mr. Walker said, "I'm going to invite you to come back tomorrow. Not as an officer, but as a neighbor. Come see how we really operate here. See the kids who stop by after school for our free homework help program. See the senior citizens who rely on our delivery service. See my son, who you were so quick to judge, teaching computer skills to elderly customers." The tension in the room began to shift into something else, not quite forgiveness, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Mr. Walker's words seemed to affect everyone differently. Some nodded in approval, others wiped away tears, and Officer Thompson looked like a man seeing clearly for the first time after a long blur. "The real question," Mr. Walker concluded, his voice carrying to every corner of the store, "is what we do with moments like these. Do we let them divide us further, or do we use them to build something better?" The answer to that question would unfold in the days to come, but right now, in this moment, something had already changed in Walker's corner store. The security cameras kept their silent watch, recording what would become a turning point not just for one officer or one family, but for an entire community. The next morning dawned bright and clear over Walker's corner store. News of yesterday's incident had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, and by opening time, the small parking lot was already filling up. People weren't just coming to shop, they were coming to show support. Mr. Walker had arrived earlier than usual, Andra by his side. They'd spent much of the night talking about what happened, about dignity, about choices, and about how to turn a painful moment into positive change. The security camera footage had already been safely backed up in 3 different places. "Dad," Andrew said as they prepared to open, arranging fresh pastries from Mrs. Rodriguez's bakery. "What if he doesn't show up?" His father paused, adjusting a display of fresh fruit. "Then that tells us everything we need to know about moving forward with the police department." He checked his watch, 8:55 a.m., but let's give him a chance. Sometimes people surprise you. The morning crowd was unlike anything they'd seen before. Teachers from Andrew's school stopped by before classes. The local church pastor came in to show solidarity. Even the mayor's assistant dropped by, expressing concern and support. Each person had a story about the store, about Andra, about the Walker family's impact on the community. At exactly 9:30 a.m., Officer Thompson walked through the door. He wasn't in uniform, instead wearing jeans and a plain blue shirt. The store fell silent. Mr. Walker, who'd been expecting this moment, stepped out from behind the counter. Thompson looked different today. Humbled, maybe even a little nervous. He carried a folder under his arm and kept his eyes down until he reached the counter. When he finally looked up, the bags under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept much either. "Mr. Walker," he began, his voice quieter than yesterday, "I spent all night reviewing my actions and writing my report." He placed the folder on the counter. "But before we get to that, I owe your son and you an apology. A public one." Anda, who'd been restocking shelves nearby, moved closer. The regular customers pretended to shop while obviously listening to every word. "I made assumptions yesterday," Thompson continued, looking directly at Andrew now. "Assumptions based on things I need to work on, things I need to unlearn. Your father offered me a chance to come back and see this place properly, and I'm here because I want to do better." Mr. Walker nodded slowly, but didn't immediately respond. He'd learned in his years of business that sometimes silence said more than words. I've also spoken with my captain, Thompson added, opening the folder. She's not happy with my conduct, but she's very interested in your father's suggestion about community engagement programs. Mrs. Chen, who'd been arranging items in her shopping basket for the past 10 minutes without actually putting anything in it, finally spoke up. Officer, you should see how many kids come here after school. This store, it's like a safe haven for them. Thompson turned to her, really seeing her this time. I'm buying that, ma'am. I should have seen it yesterday, but He trailed off, looking around at the family photos, the community bulletin board, the homework help schedule posted by the counter. Well, Mr. Walker finally said, seeing it now as a start. He pulled out a chair from behind the counter, one they kept for elderly customers. Why don't you sit down, Officer Thompson? Let me show you something. He reached under the counter and pulled out a thick photo album. This is 20 years of community history right here. That's Andrew's first day helping in the store. He was 6. He pointed to a faded photograph of a tiny boy attempting to sweep with a broom twice his size. As they flipped through the pages, more customers gathered around. Each photo sparked a memory, a story. The time the store stayed open during the big storm 3 years ago, becoming a makeshift shelter. The annual back-to-school supply drive. The Christmas when they delivered groceries to 30 families in need. Officer Thompson listened, really listened, as the story of Walker's corner store unfolded through the voices of the community. His face showed a mix of emotions, shame at his actions, but also something else, a growing understanding of what he'd almost destroyed with his assumptions. This is more than a store, he finally said, almost to himself. This is community, Andra finished for him. It's where people come together, even when things go wrong, especially when things go wrong. Mr. Walker closed the photo album gently. Officer Thompson, you made a mistake yesterday, a serious one. But what matters now is what we do going forward. Are you ready to be part of the solution? The question hung in the air, weighted with possibility. The answer would determine not just Officer Thompson's future in the community, but perhaps the beginning of a larger change. 1 week after the incident, Walker's corner store buzzed with unusual activity. The regular after-school crowd of students found themselves sharing space with several police officers, not there to patrol, but to participate in the first community dialogue session. Mr. Walker had transformed the store's back room, usually used for storage, into a meeting space. Folding chairs formed a circle, and Mrs. Rodriguez had provided a generous spread of pastries. Officer Thompson sat somewhat stiffly, now in uniform, but his presence was a statement in itself. I want to thank everyone for coming, Mr. Walker began, standing before the gathered group. Local residents, store regulars, police officers, and community leaders filled every chair. Andrew sat next to his father, notepad ready to record the meeting's points. Last week, we had an incident that could have ended very differently, Mr. Walker continued. Instead of letting it divide us, we're using it as a bridge to understanding. Officer Thompson and Captain Rivera have worked with us to create something new. Captain Rivera, a woman with graying hair and sharp eyes, stood up next to Mr. Walker. What happened last week was unacceptable, she stated firmly. But Mr. Walker offered us an opportunity instead of just criticism. Today, we're launching our new community bridge program. Andrew watched as his father unveiled a large poster board. The store's security cameras caught the moment from multiple angles, not as tools of suspicion now, but as witnesses to positive change. Every week, Mr. Walker explained, officers will spend time here, not as law enforcement, but as neighbors. They'll help with homework alongside our regular tutors. They'll assist elderly customers with their shopping. They'll become part of the daily life of the store. Officer Thompson stood up, his voice carrying a new humility. I made a mistake based on prejudice, he admitted openly. But Mr. Walker and Andrew showed me what real community policing should look like. It's not about power, it's about service. The back room fell silent as Thompson's words sank in. Then Mrs. Chen spoke up from her seat near the window. Last week, I was ready to post that video online, she said, holding up her phone. Instead, I'm recording this meeting to show how communities can heal. A young officer raised her hand. But how do we make sure this isn't just a one-time thing? How do we create real change? Andrew stepped forward, surprising even his father. Maybe that's where I come in, he said. The confidence in his voice made Mr. Walker's chest swell with pride. "I've been working on an app, something that can help connect officers with community events, store programs, and volunteer opportunities." He pulled out his laptop and showed a simple but elegant interface. "It's like a bridge between the police department and our neighborhood. Officers can see where they're needed, and community members can see who's serving their area." Captain Rivera leaned forward, clearly interested. "You developed this yourself?" "Yes, ma'am," Andrew replied. "I've been learning coding through our store's computer literacy program. The same one Officer Thompson will be helping with starting next week." He glanced at Thompson, who nodded in confirmation. The meeting continued for 2 hours, with ideas flowing freely. Community members shared their experiences, both positive and negative, with law enforcement. Officers spoke about their challenges and fears. Real dialogue was happening, perhaps for the first time. As the session wound down, Mr. Walker stood again. "This is just the beginning," he said. "Change doesn't happen in one meeting or even 10. But it happens every time we choose to see each other as human beings first." The group broke into smaller clusters, officers and residents talking informally over coffee and pastries. Officer Thompson approached Andra, who was showing his app to some interested officers. "You know," Thompson said quietly, "when I first walked into this store last week, I thought I knew everything I needed to know in one glance. I've never been more wrong in my life." Andra looked up from his laptop. "Sometimes the best view comes after you change your perspective," he replied, surprising himself with the wisdom in his words. As the evening light filtered through the store windows, casting long shadows across the meeting room, there was a sense that something significant had shifted. The security cameras kept their silent vigil, recording not just a meeting, but the beginning of a transformation. 6 months ago, Mr. Walker began, "We had a choice to make. We could let one incident define us, or we could use it to redefine ourselves." He looked around the circle, meeting each person's eyes. "Every day since then, we've chosen to build bridges instead of walls." The security cameras kept rolling, but now they captured something remarkable. A community that had turned a moment of potential tragedy into lasting triumph. As the evening sun cast long shadows through the store windows, the gathered group shared stories, plans, and hopes for the future. And in that moment, Walker's Corner Store stood as proof that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes, if people are brave enough to build bridges instead of burning them.